Before we begin today's episode, I want to take a moment to be transparent with you about what you're about to hear. This episode and the entire Out of the Flames series deals directly with school violence, teacher trauma, and the murder of a student on a school campus during school hours. I was present for these events, and I'm going to speak about them with the honesty and specificity they deserve, which means I will not be softening this material or speaking around it. If these are topics you need to approach carefully or step away from entirely, please honor what you know about yourself. There's no version of this conversation that requires you to harm yourself to participate in it. For those of you who are staying, I'm glad you're here. This story has needed to be told for a long time. Welcome back to Reclaim the Room. I'm Howard, and today I'm doing something I've been building toward for a while now. I'm telling my own story in my own voice for the first time in this space. My co host Ridley has carried this podcast with more grace than I have adequate words for, while I've been working through something that took me a long time to find language for. This series, Out of the Flames, is that language. 6 episodes, solo. My account of what happened at my school, what it did to me, and where it has brought me since. I want to be clear at the outset about one thing. I'm not going to name the school, the district, or any administrator or official by name in this series. That is not because I'm protecting anyone, it's because the story I'm telling is larger than any one institution. And I want you to be able to hear it that way. The people who need to recognize themselves in this account will recognize themselves. I'm not concerned about that. So, let me take you back to a Monday in March. Before I take you into the specifics of that day, I need you to understand the context because the events I'm about to describe did not happen in a vacuum, and the way they were handled by the institution did not happen in a vacuum either. Both were the product of an environment that had, over the course of the school year, normalized a level of chronic instability and violence that should have been treated as a crisis long before it became one. We were halfway through a year that had already been defined by fights almost every day, sometimes more than once a day. Lockdowns and security holes were so frequent and so routine that they had genuinely stopped registering as anything out of the ordinary. Teachers and students alike have been conditioned through sheer repetition to move through them with a practiced indifference that looked like composure from the outside, but was something closer to exhaustion on the inside. When the unthinkable happens often enough, you stop flinching at it. Your body recalibrates. And that recalibration becomes, for the institution, evidence that the baseline is manageable because no one is visibly falling apart, which is not at all the same as everyone being okay. That's the environment I was working in on that Monday morning. And I think you need to hold that in your mind as I tell you what happened next. That morning, before class had even started, I overheard one of my students talking to his friend about what he believed had happened in the hallway. Two girls had gotten into a fight, he said. One of them had her nose broken. There was blood everywhere. He had no idea what truly occurred, and neither did I. I told him to hush, and the bell to begin class rang. Shortly after the bell, my neighbor's son came in. And I want to give you a little context here because it matters. Earlier in the year, I had told him that if the hallways were ever too chaotic to navigate safely, he should skip the chaos and come straight to my classroom and I would write him a pass. I said that to him because in that building, at that point in the year, the hallways were sometimes genuinely unsafe to be in. That was just the reality of where we were. So when he came in after the tardy bell that morning, I knew exactly why, and I had no reason to question it. I started writing him that pass. While I was writing it, the lockdown call came over the intercom. And I want to be specific about my reaction at that moment because it's the detail that captures everything I've been trying to say about what the environment had done to all of us. My first thought was that it was a routine hole. The hallways had looked clear when my neighbor's son came in. There was no visible chaos, and at that school, At that point in the year, a lockdown call was something that happened regularly enough that my default assumption was always that it was procedural rather than urgent. So I kept writing a pass. Before I could finish it, my coworker came rushing through the door and said, "Howard, we're on a real lockdown." I set the pass on my desk, and even then, even after she said that, I still moved with no particular urgency to check the doors, cover the windows, and turn off the lights. I did everything I was trained to do in the correct order, and there was simply no alarm in my body about any of it because this was the environment we were in. Real lockdowns and routine holds had become indistinguishable from one another in how they felt because both had happened so many times that the physiological difference between them had worn away. That is not a personal failure. That's what chronic exposure to an unsafe environment does to a person's threat response over time. It flattens it. We gathered students from 3 science classes and moved into our designated lockdown space, a windowless storage room. The air was close and stuffy, the way it always was in there, and the students settled in with the ease of people who had done it before. They weren't crying, they weren't frightened. They were sneaking snacks out of their bags and getting their phones out, doing every mischievous thing that middle schoolers do when they sense that the usual rules are suspended. Because for them too, this was familiar territory. We had all been normalized into it together. It was notably 2 periods before their lunch. We had been in that storage room for some time when the phone started. Not the school's phones, not any official communication channel, but our personal cell phones, teachers' phones, mine included. What was unusual was where the calls and messages were coming from, our families, people on the outside. And the tone of those messages was not casual. They were panicked, urgent, asking if we were okay, asking what was happening. But here's what struck me in the moment and what I've thought about many times since. Whatever was happening outside had not yet made the news. There was nothing on any local news channel, nothing on social media that had gone wild. Our families were not reacting to a headline. They were reacting to something they could see, whether there was an unusual number of emergency vehicles in the area or word of mouth traveling faster than the media. I can't say with certainty. But they knew something serious was unfolding, and they were reaching out to us because they were scared for us. And inside the school, inside that windowless storage room where I was sitting with 3 classes full of students, we knew nothing. No intercom announcement, no email, no text to staff, no phone call from administration, nothing. Our families on the outside had more information about what was happening at our school than we did, and they were not in the building. I can't overstate what that silence communicated, not just in that moment, but in every moment that followed. It told us with absolute clarity where we ranked in the institutional hierarchy of concern. Let this sit. That's when I heard the helicopter, and something shifted in me. Below thought, below any conscious processing, something in my gut that had been moving through this lockdown on autopilot suddenly stopped. My instinct landed on one thing immediately. Whatever is happening outside this room, these children do not need to feel it in here. So I kept my voice even, kept the environment steady, kept doing what I was there to do. But I knew in the way you know things before you can articulate them that this was no longer routine. Eventually, an administrator came and unlocked the door to our room. No explanation was given to the teachers or to the students. They simply told the students to grab their things and exit through the side door. That was the entirety of the communication. We walked outside into what I can only describe as organized chaos. A sea of buses that had been staged, apparently without anyone having thought through what we were supposed to do when we got to them. There were no directions. There was no designated area for our class or our grade level or anything else. There was no one positioned to tell us where we were going or why. Just get on the bus. As we were being directed toward the buses, I called my neighbor, whose son was still with me, to let her know that he was safe and that I had him. She told me where we were being taken, not because there had been any official communication to me or to any of the teachers around me, but because the parents had been called, emailed, and texted. The parents had been informed of our destination. The teachers have received nothing. I want to just say that plainly because I think it deserves to be said plainly. The parents knew where we were going, we did not. As we were boarding, I asked one of the bus drivers where we were headed. He looked at me and said, "This is really bad. They don't know if she'll make it." It wasn't until I was on the bus and talking to another teacher that I found out who. My heart sank in a way I don't have a better word for than that. It just dropped. And once I was seated and processing what I now knew, the full force of what had been happening around us hit me. They had collected us, adults, professionals, the people responsible for the children in that building, and loaded us onto buses with no official explanation and no stated destination. In a political climate where that kind of thing is not a small matter, how do you put an adult on a bus and not tell her where she's going? That's not a logistical oversight. That's the result of a culture in which the people who work in those buildings are simply not considered in the way that they should be. But as furious as I was on that bus, I also knew that what was waiting for us when we arrived was going to be worse. And it was. They brought us to a church that had been designated as the Reunification Center. The facility could accommodate generously around 400 people. Our school has more than 1,100 students. What that looked like in practice was exactly what you might imagine. Kids everywhere, on hallway floors, in the sanctuary, waiting for their parents to come and claim them in a space that was nowhere near equipped for the volume of people inside it. Most of the teachers, self included, had left everything behind: purses, keys, personal phones, at what was now a crime scene. We had gone in a take care of the students mode from the moment the lockdown was called, and that mode had not turned off. We were making sure the students were fed. We were helping reunite parents with their children. We were managing emotional temperature of a space that was becoming more fragile by the hour. Lunches had been brought for the students and they ate on the floor, the way you do when circumstances don't allow for anything else. And by the time the afternoon wore on, most of them had eaten and were sitting with their phones, talking to each other, waiting. And that's when the word started to spread. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't an official notification. It was the way information moves among teenagers when an institution fails to get ahead of it, phone to phone, message to message, a ripple that moved through that church faster than any administrator could have contained it, even if they had wanted to. Students began to find out in real time that their classmate had died, and the grief that followed was not quiet. It was the kind of grief that comes out of the body before the mind has time to shape it. Crying, anger, disbelief, the particular devastation of being young and encountering something that has no framework yet. I was in the sanctuary when I heard it from the students around me. "She's gone, Miss Howard." I left. I couldn't stay in that room. I went outside and I called my husband and told him what had happened. And I want you to understand what was still true in that moment. There had been no official communication from the district. Nothing. Not a word to the staff about what had occurred, about the status of our student, about anything. Teachers were left to piece together the truth the same way students were, from phones, from each other, from fragments of information that filtered in from the outside. That silence, that deliberate institutional silence, is something I will carry for the rest of my life. At some point, a district administrator gathered the staff together. I won't call it a support meeting because it wasn't that. What it was, in the most honest terms I can offer, was an exercise in narrative management, a clear effort to discourage us from speaking to the media that had gathered outside the church. Nothing was said about what happened at the school. Nothing was said about the death of a student. There was no acknowledgement of what the people in that room had lived through that day. No expression of compassion, no recognition of our humanity. Just words about controlling the story. That was the last time I saw our principal and one of our assistant principals. I left around 5 o'clock that evening, exhausted, numb, and carrying anger I did not yet have the full vocabulary for. Tuesday, there was no school. The crime scene was still being cleaned. Wednesday, we were called to a meeting at the media center. The school building itself was still being processed and was not available to us. I was not holding it together in any meaningful way that morning. I was walking around crying, and I was not making any particular effort to hide it because I wasn't capable of hiding it. I walked up to one of the local pastors who had come to offer support to the staff, and I said to him that I couldn't do this anymore. He looked at me with what I can only describe as genuine concern, not the performed concern of an institutional representative, but the real kind. He said that God says you can't quit. And then he asked me what about the other 100+ students who still needed me, who were going to walk back through those doors and look for me. I told him they had failed that baby. He said, but what about the others? That question grounded me in the way that only a direct and honest question can. It didn't resolve anything. It didn't fix the grief or the anger or the exhaustion, but it gave me something to stand on in that moment. And I needed something to stand on. That same Wednesday, I walked up to the district superintendent and told her directly that I was not ready to go back into that building. We were scheduled to return the following day with no students, just staff. She looked at me and said, I can't force you. Just take a personal day. I had never in my professional life felt so devalued, so unseen, so completely disregarded by an employer. I know this is a business, but goodness, there is a categorical difference between running an organization efficiently and treating the human beings inside it as though their psychological survival is a private matter that has nothing to do with you. A child had been murdered in our building 48 hours before that conversation. And the response I received when I said I wasn't ready was, take a personal day. Thursday, we returned to the school. I always arrive early. That quiet hour before the day begins has always been mine. The time I use to prepare, to settle into the space, to be ready. So I was there well before I was required to be, and I pulled into the parking lot and saw the memorial that had assembled itself under the school's marquee. Stuffed animals, flowers, things her friends and classmates had brought and left there. I sat in my car for a long time before I could make myself go in. When I did walk in, through the side door I always use, I went straight to my classroom. The building felt different in a way I don't know how to fully describe. A heaviness in the air, a stillness that didn't feel like peace, the strong smell of disinfectant that had been used to clean what needed to be cleaned. And there on my desk, exactly where I'd set it down when the lockdown was called, was the tardy pass I'd written for my neighbor's son. Still sitting there, 3 days later, as if time had simply stopped and resumed without moving anything in between. I sat down and I held that pass, and the full weight of everything that had happened on that Monday came down on me all at once. The lockdown, the bus, the church, hearing students say she was gone, the drive home, all of it. I cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry in the days since. Because in the days since, there had always been something that needed managing. And now there was just me, alone in my classroom with a tardy pass that never got delivered. I stayed in my classroom as long as I possibly could before I had to make my way to the cafeteria, where the staff meeting had been called. And to get to the cafeteria, I had to walk past the stairwell. The last time I had seen her was in that stairwell. She was at the top looking down at me, and she was smiling, and she said, I'm being good, Miss Howard. I'm not going to be tardy. The stairwell had been cleaned. Everything had been cleaned. And I understand why that was necessary. And I also understand that there is something that disinfectant can't reach. The memory of a person in a place, the imprint of a presence that is no longer there. I still looked for her in that stairwell. I couldn't help it. I looked up the way I always had when I passed it, because some part of me had not yet accepted that she wouldn't be there. She had earned what I call the special Miss Howard love. Not every student does, not because I love anyone less, but because some students reach a part of you that others don't access. She was one of those. She was funny, and she had her own particular spirit, and she was gone. And the building had been scrubbed to the point to make it impossible to pretend otherwise. The week following the murder was spring break, and I want to tell you what spring break looked like for me that year because it wasn't a break in any meaningful sense of the word. It was the first time I'd been still long enough for everything I had been moving through to actually catch up with me. I sat at the kitchen table with my husband and some friends, and we were talking about what had happened, about the murder, about the district, about the failure of it all. And I was venting in the way that you do when you've been holding something for too long and finally have a space that feels safe enough to release it. And my husband asked me a question that I wasn't prepared for. He asked, "What should they have done?" That question broke something in me. I screamed, I cried, I couldn't answer him. Not because I don't know what competent crisis response looks like, not because I'm unfamiliar with what genuine institutional care for its people would have required, but because it was not my job to have that answer. It was never my job to have that answer. That answer was the responsibility of the people who had been entrusted with the safety of 1,100 children and every adult who showed up every day to serve them. They had that responsibility. They had failed at it. And being asked to articulate what they should have done differently meant, in that moment, being asked to do their intellectual labor on top of carrying their failure. And something in me simply could. What had kept me in teaching for more than 15 years, it was always the students, the relationships, the specific and irreplaceable experience of watching a young person understand something they didn't understand before and knowing you were part of how that happened. But what that Monday had done and what everything that came after it had compounded was push me to a place where I could no longer pretend that the thing I believed in had not failed, not just once, but systemically and at every level. The system I had given myself to had not just fallen short, it had actively disregarded the humanity of every person inside that building. When staff returned that following week after spring break, the school had been transformed in ways that were jarring. Metal detectors that had never been operational in the year and a half I had worked there were now turned on and in use, which I found almost darkly comical because it raised an obvious question that no one in leadership seemed interested in answering. If these systems existed, why have we gone the entire school year without them functioning? District administrators were everywhere, barking orders, repositioning everything, talking to teachers as though we had not just collectively survived something traumatic, and as though we had not, in fact, been running that school successfully without their daily presence for months. Teachers were being yelled at. The culture of the building was being dismantled from the top down without care, without acknowledgement of what we had all been through, and without a single person in a position of authority saying the one thing we all needed to hear, which was simply, "We know what you've been through and we are sorry." I'm telling this story because teachers are surviving things that no one sees, and that this profession has never adequately made space to talk about. And when we do try to name what's happening to us, when we try to speak with any honesty about the conditions we are working in, we're told to watch our tone, to remain professional, to stay positive. I have no interest in any of those instructions, not in this space and not in this series. What I've described today is episode 1 of this story. In the episodes that follow, we go deeper into what the district did with our grief in the days after, into the policy theater of the phone bans and the scripted lessons, into asking myself whether I was going back, and into the decision I eventually made. I will tell you where I am now, which is a more honest and more complicated place than I can summarize in a sentence. Before I go, I want to leave you with a question. And I genuinely mean that. I want to hear from you in the comments. What was the moment you realized the system was not going to protect you? You can answer in one word, one sentence, whatever form the answer takes you. You do not owe anyone context, and you are not alone in this. I'm Howard. This is Reclaim the Room, and thank you for listening.